Hello everyone. Today we're going to be diving into something a little bit different. We're going to be discussing 3 men who have been on the run in Canada for decades for murder. 3 fugitives that were never caught. From a man who murdered his wife's best friend in the Yukon, to a small town loner who took revenge on 4 men with his shotgun, to a truck driver who flew across the world to avoid charges. All of these men are extremely dangerous and could still be walking our streets. Their names and faces need to be out there, not just so that their victims can get justice, but so that they can't victimize anyone else. The case of Ronald Jeffrey Bax is one that I came across while I was actually researching missing persons cases. And then when I dug a little deeper into his disappearance, I realized he was wanted by the RCMP. 30-year-old Ronald Bax was known as a sculptor, taxidermist, outdoorsman, and an expert with guns living in the lakeside town of Carcross in Canada's Yukon near the British Columbia border. However, Ronald is now suspected for murder. On March 1st of 1992, his wife Lynn would flee to a shelter for battered women after years of accusing her husband of DV. Her friend Crystal Senek would visit her that night. It's alleged that Ronald hated Crystal because that meant his wife had someone to confide in, to talk to about the abuse that he was inflicting upon her, which is something that we often see in abusive relationships, where the one partner who's abusive doesn't want the partner he's abusing or she is abusing to have any friends or anyone around them. They want to isolate the person. And it seems like that was what may have been happening here. He was trying to isolate Lynn. Lynn was trying to get help. She fled to a women's shelter, and she did have a friend that she confided in, a very good friend who was speaking up for her. 29-year-old Crystal was loved by her family and friends alike. She was fiercely independent, a champion arm wrestler, an engineer, and she worked at the Federal Land Claims Office in Whitehorse. But that March in 1992 would change everything. After visiting Lynn, Crystal would return home around 11 p.m., and she would be shot by a single bullet at close range in her doorway by someone laying in wait. Over 12 hours later, at 12:30 p.m., Crystal's body would be discovered in the doorway of her home on Tagish Road by police. By 6 p.m., police would storm Ronald's home, which was also just down the street on Tagish Road. However, when they entered, Ronald was nowhere to be found. However, they did end up locating multiple firearms. After Crystal's murder, Ronald would vanish, last being seen in Carcross, Yukon. On the night of the murder, Ronald had actually spoken to a friend on the telephone, but this would be the last contact that he would have with anyone. Keep in mind, all of this was happening in the winter, in the Yukon. And the following day, the weather conditions worsened. The snow was freezing to ice and the winds were harsh, making the search efforts extremely difficult. Police dogs were brought in, but because of the conditions, they couldn't track Ronald. Helicopters and planes were being used. Nearly 25 officers were involved in the investigation. However, it was noted that Ronald had 2 vehicles. However, both of those vehicles were missing from the home, leading investigators to consider if he had a partner. Ronald was extremely familiar with the wilderness, with weapons, and he'd actually worked as a big game guide, meaning he could have easily traveled off-grid and lived remotely. Ronald was also said to have family in Michigan in the US, which was around 3,000 miles away, or a 51-hour straight drive across Canada and the US. Police have a strong belief that if Ronald is alive, he spent the last 30 years hiding somewhere in the US. Ronald would only be around 63 years old now. There is a great chance that he's still alive out there somewhere. He has blue eyes and had blonde wavy hair at the time of his disappearance, which may have since grayed. He has a mole in the front left side of his neck and a Pegasus tattoo on his upper right arm. Do you recognize this man or these tattoos? 43-year-old Kevin Lewis Vermette was a carpenter and handyman who was an experienced outdoorsman. He was born and raised in Kitimat, British Columbia, an isolated community in the northwestern part of the province with beautiful mountain views. It's said that he lived at a local motel there, being described as a loner with an affection for photography, guns, and the outdoors. Kevin was described as being very fit. He also owned a black Labrador retriever that he named Shadow that he often took on long hikes. And when he'd go on these hikes, he'd always bring his 12-gauge shotgun just in case they ran into any big animals. He was very familiar with the trails and wilderness around the small town that he grew up in. Kevin also had a passion for fixing up old cars. However, in 1991, Kevin would claim bankruptcy. And he also seemed to be strangely very secretive and didn't like to talk about his life or his past, considering everyone in the small town knew each other. Everyone would have known his life anyways. At one point, Kevin ended up lying to the owner of the motel, who was also his boss, telling him that he had no family and that he only had a mother that lived in Jasper, Alberta. However, Kevin's mother, Elma, actually lived near town, and he also had a brother and sister who lived in town. So why was Kevin lying about such simple things, especially in a town where everyone knew each other? Things would take a turn in the summer of 1997. Kevin had been in an ongoing argument with 4 young men who would play loud rap music in the town's gym. But it's said that after Kevin confronted the men about their inappropriate music, they ended up turning it off and apologizing. These men that Kevin had issues with were all around 20 to 21 years old. Their names being Mike Morrow, David Nunez, Mark Teves, and Don Oliveira. All of these men were good friends and had grew up together and hung out together their entire lives. Now, there was a lot of comments online about locals talking about the incident and incidents around that time that were happening. One local described being at that gym the time that Kevin was fighting with these men about the rap music, saying that after Kevin had left the gym, the men ended up turning the music back on, and Kevin heard them turn the music back on, so he came back to the gym angry. Which is strange because he was leaving to go home, so why would he care what they were playing at the gym? I guess we do have to understand as well that this was a small town in the middle of Canada, and rap music back then wasn't something that was widely accepted. This local saying, and I quote, "I was in the River Lodge weight room one time when Donnie and Kevin got into a shoving match. Another guy got between them and Kevin slapped Donnie across the face. This was probably the April or May before the murders. I moved to Kamloops May of 1997, and one afternoon I was walking downtown in Victoria Street and there was Kevin walking with a dog. We recognized each other from the gym and we exchanged a polite, 'Hey, how's it going?' and then went on our separate ways. This was maybe a month or so before the murders." End quote. Meaning Kevin was so upset with these men over their music that they were playing that he physically assaulted one of them. Another local recalling that he knew Kevin and these men as well, singing a different tune about the situation, saying, and I quote, "I knew Kevin. He would let my autistic brother help him do carpentry in my neighborhood. He was a nice, quiet guy from what I remember. The people he shot were older than me, but I do remember there was another group, maybe not the ones that were killed, but ones that they were associated with would torment his older mother. They would tear her car apart and pee on the seats. I also remember the survivor at one of my parties a year later trying to be a tough guy with a knife." End quote. There were other stories as well about altercations between Kevin and these four men. One where they all ran into each other at a local donut shop, and as Kevin was pulling away, he ended up blowing them kisses out the window. There was also statements that Kevin would make racial slurs towards these four men because they were all of Portuguese descent. The day before the murders, Kevin would find the tires of his beloved truck slashed. From what I learned, his truck sat in the motel parking lot which he lived at, and he had woken up in the morning to find the tires slashed, so they'd been slashed overnight and no one had actually witnessed it happening. But Kevin seemed to have a feeling of who did it, meaning things were about to escalate. What's even more awful is that it's alleged that in the aftermath, teens would come forward and confess to slashing Kevin's tires. However, it wasn't the four that he thought it was. It wasn't the four men that he was placing all his anger towards. On the night of July 12th of 1997, the four men were going to drive to a party, about 60 kilometers north of town to an area called Terrace. Before this, though, they would end up at a campground called Hirsch Creek Park in Kitimat to meet up with the rest of their friends, so that they could all go to what was called a stag, which I'm pretty sure is more of a Canadian term for a bachelor party. They call it stag and doe. I've never really heard that term being used in the US before, but I hear it all the time in Canada. The four men would end up arriving at this campground around 9 p.m. for the meetup. However, their friends weren't quite there yet waiting for them. Instead, Kevin also was somehow at this park and would change all of their lives forever. Dom would later tell police that Kevin had pulled up behind them in his truck, blocking them in, and they all watched in their rearview mirrors as he got out of his truck holding something in his hands. Now, the four men thought Kevin was just trying to scare them and that he had gotten out of his truck carrying a baseball bat, so they all began getting out of the vehicle to confront Kevin. However, Kevin didn't have a baseball bat. He had his 12-gauge shotgun, and he began firing at the men as they got out of the truck before they could even react. Dom would say that he tried to run out of fear, but he was hit by a bullet and collapsed, and he would end up hearing one of his friends screaming no before another shot rang out, and he was silenced. Dom would end up passing out and losing 60% of his blood. His friends Mike, David, and Mark all succumbing to their injuries before help could arrive. After mowing down four men with his shotgun, Kevin would jump back in his truck and flee the scene. Others nearby at the campgrounds would end up hearing the shots and calling for help. Dom would end up being airlifted all the way to Vancouver, and he somehow miraculously survived that flight because not only was he laying on the ground for a long period of time, but then he had to be flown across the province for help. Dom would end up having a punctured esophagus, damaged stomach, a punctured diaphragm, a badly damaged spleen, and his arm was nearly lost due to the damage. Shotgun shells are no joke. It's not just like a single bullet that gets penetrated into your body. Normally shotgun shells spray, so you're getting hit in multiple spots on your body. And on top of that, from what I learned, Kevin used like very heavy duty bullets that are used for like bears and large animals like that. So the bullets were even more powerful that he was using against these four men. So the fact that Don survived is miraculous, honestly. After leaving the scene, Kevin would then abandon his truck at the motel he lived at and fled into the mountain wilderness with his shotgun and his dog Shadow. Meanwhile, police were having a standoff with Kevin's empty hotel room because apparently there was this law that had just been enacted where police couldn't just break down his door without a warrant, even though he had just allegedly murdered 3 people. meaning Kevin would end up having a huge lead on law enforcement because they thought he was inside of his hotel room, basically having a standoff. They knocked on the door, didn't hear anything, and they basically all just sat outside for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours waiting for him to come out. But he wasn't even in there. He had literally dropped his truck off, grabbed his dog, and immediately left into the wilderness and fled. So at this point, he could have been anywhere. The shooting ended up rocking the small town because everyone knew each other there, including the 4 men who had just been attacked and Kevin himself. However, just days after the shooting and Kevin fleeing, his dog Shadow would return on its own. Police would continue to search and search, thinking they blocked him into a small portion of the wilderness there. However, they still couldn't find him, which I don't know why they think they'd have him blocked in because he had such a lead on them. He could have, again, literally fled anywhere. His mother would even go on the news pleading for him to come home and turn himself in. But still, Kevin didn't show back up. Nearly 30 years later, Kevin has still not been located. The RCMP has theories from everything from he unalived himself to he succumbed to the elements to he ran away and started a new life. But the fact that he took his dog makes me want to believe that he wasn't leaving to unalive himself. You'd think he would have left his dog somewhere safe. I can't see him taking this dog that he loved and cared so much for into the woods just so that it can be left there to be attacked by wild animals or something if he did unalive himself. And I think if he was going out there to unalive himself with his dog and he wanted to take his dog with him, he might have possibly also killed the dog before unaliving himself. It makes me think that he probably did have a backup plan if things got hairy and then he went and executed it. And if his dog had never been found, I would have just completely thought that that's probably what happened. However, Shadow returned home. So it does make me think that possibly Kevin could have been attacked by a wild animal and then Shadow ran off because normally a dog's not going to stay if something scary is happening. Unfortunately, dogs normally do run out of fear. Or if he did for some reason unalive himself and left his dog alive, the dog would have ran back, you'd think. Although I guess there is a possibility that he did die due to the harsh wilderness and the elements at that point in time as well. But he was a very experienced outdoorsman. He did know the area extremely well. So I could see him maybe hitching a ride or somehow getting far enough where police couldn't find him, especially since he did have such a long lead. But the fact that police and searchers went through those areas so thoroughly, as so they say, they didn't find any signs of him, makes me do believe that he did get far enough away, that police just didn't find him if he did run. You know, there are other speculations that he fled to Alaska since it wasn't too far away from there, which I could also see as well. Again, he was an experienced outdoorsman. He had a gun, so he had protection if anything was to attack him. So could Kevin be out there just living somewhere off grid? Or could he be living somewhere like Alaska, pulling a Dexter Morgan and hiding out in a small town where no one knows his name? Take a good look at Kevin once again, because he could still be alive out there. Kevin's described as 5'9" tall, around 161 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes. His hair would most likely be gray at this point. He wore prescription glasses and had multiple tattoos, including a cat with the word lucky on his upper right arm, a coyote and moon and dagger through a red rose on his upper left arm. He'd be around 70 years old, and if he is still alive, he may not look like this picture anymore at all, which is the hardest part with missing persons cases. When decades and decades pass, the person's not going to look like their photo anymore, so all we have are the last images of this person. But when decades pass, they're not going to look the same anymore, so we can't be looking for this person anymore, which is really good when you have sketch artists come in and do age progressions, because it's what you should be looking out for. You're not looking for this young man anymore. Kevin is thought to be armed, dangerous, and violent, and there is still a nationwide call for his arrest for 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. But I guess his lucky tattoo was right, because he has to be darn lucky to not be caught after all this time. On July 3rd of 2011, 18-year-old Margarita Shumakova would disappear from Toronto. Margarita lived with her mother in the North York region of Toronto and was a high school student at the Scarborough Centre for Alternative Studies. That night, Margarita is thought to have gone out with a small group of friends to a nightclub in Toronto called City Nightclub on 296 Richmond Street West. She was last seen wearing a black dress and standing outside of the nightclub around 1 a.m. She would be reported missing the next day on July 4th when she didn't return home. A property owner would end up finding Margarita's body a few days later on July 9th, as they were walking on the side of a country road called Concession Road 8 near Uxbridge, Ontario. Police would never report how Margarita died, however, they did describe it as she was slain, and did state that her murderer was on the loose. Now, there aren't much details on how police ended up figuring out who her killer was, or how they knew each other, how they met, what happened, anything regarding that. All we know is that her killer is suspected to be 35-year-old Babak. As I said, there is little information on Margarita's murder and Babak's motives, but police believe after Babak killed killed Margarita, he drove to Mexico and then boarded a flight to Germany, and from there, he flew to Tehran, Iran. Babak is said to be a truck driver by trade and has no fixed address, so he could literally be anywhere. It's said for work, he traveled extensively along the East Coast from Canada to Florida, as well as through Western Canada into California and Texas. Babak also spent time in Indonesia before moving to Canada. Police do believe, however, that he is still in Iran. It seems like it took a long time for police to figure out who Margarita's murderer was, and the fact that Babak had the chance to not only fly to a different country, but fly across the world is extremely scary. And that means that this man, that this alleged murderer, could be anywhere out there right now. And that is terrifying, that he could be walking the streets of Canada, the US, Indonesia, Iran, Germany, anywhere right now. And I've never heard his name before. I'd never seen his face before until now when I researched this case. And I think that this man is just out there. It's terrifying. And when you really start diving into these cases and how many fugitives and how many people are on the most wanted lists, not just in Canada, the US, just everywhere in the world, it is terrifying that these people could just be walking the streets still to this day. And you might not know that you're walking past them on the street because you've never seen their face before or heard their name before. Take one more good look at Babak. He is of Iranian descent with black hair and brown eyes, standing around 5 foot 9 inches tall. That is all the information we have on him, unfortunately. Take one more good look at these three men. Do you have any information on Ronald, Kevin, or Babak? If you spot these men anywhere or have any information on their whereabouts, please do not approach them. They are all considered dangerous. I'll have all the appropriate authorities to contact for each of these individuals down below in the description. If you know something or see something, please say something. As always, I hope you all stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I hope to see you in the next video.